Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, where history's greatest minds speak again, and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and we've journeyed through a remarkable progression of political and moral thought. Machiavelli showed us that power operates by its own ruthless logic. Hobbes argued that absolute sovereignty is necessary to escape the chaos of nature. Locke touted that natural rights and consent limit legitimate authority. Rousseau insisted that people themselves must remain sovereign through democratic participation. Montesquieu designed the institutional machinery, separation of powers and checks and balances, that makes constitutional government work. And Kant provided the moral foundation, grounding politics in human dignity and rational autonomy.
But there's a philosopher we haven't yet met, a thinker who came before Kant chronologically and who posed challenges so devastating that Kant spent his entire career trying to answer them. A philosopher who questioned whether we can know anything with certainty, whether reason can guide morality, whether causation is real, whether the self even exists. A philosopher whose skepticism shook the foundations of the Enlightenment itself. This is the story of David Hume, the great skeptic who challenged everything the Enlightenment claimed to know about reason, morality, and knowledge. His questions remain unanswered, his challenges remain unmet, and his influence on philosophy, from Kant to modern empiricism, from utilitarianism to neuroscience, is impossible to overstate. Kant himself admitted that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber, forcing him to rebuild philosophy from the ground up.
David Hume was born on May 7, 1711, in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a family of minor gentry with limited means. While philosophers like Rousseau wandered across Europe challenging civilization, and Kant never left his hometown, Hume occupied a middle ground. He traveled extensively, but always returned to Scotland. He engaged with society rather than withdrawing from it, and he was beloved for his warmth and wit, despite holding views that scandalized religious authorities. Unlike many philosophers who were prickly, difficult, or isolated, Hume was known as le bon David, the good David, among the French philosophers. He was genuinely likable, a charming dinner companion, a loyal friend. Adam Smith, the great economist and Hume's closest friend, said of him, "Upon the whole, I have always considered him, both in his lifetime and since his death, as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit." This is remarkable because Hume's philosophical views were radical, even dangerous for his time. He was effectively an atheist in an age when atheism could ruin your career and threaten your life. He argued that miracles were irrational to believe in, that religion arose from fear and ignorance, that reason is the slave of the passions rather than their master, that we have no rational basis for believing in causation or the external world, or even the self. These weren't the views of a safe conventional thinker.
Yet Hume managed to express them with such wit, charm, and philosophical care that he became one of the most influential thinkers of the 18th century. Hume's intellectual career began early and spectacularly. At age 12, he entered the University of Edinburgh, but left without a degree around age 15, finding the curriculum stale and uninspiring. He tried studying law to please his family, but found it nauseous. Instead, he pursued philosophy obsessively, reading voraciously, thinking intensely. At age 23, while living in France at La Flèche, the same Jesuit college where Descartes had studied, he began writing what would become one of the most influential works, a treatise of human nature. Published in 3 volumes between 1739 and 1740, when Hume was still in his late 20s, the treatise attempted nothing less than a complete science of human nature, based on empirical observation and careful reasoning. Hume wanted to do for the mind what Newton had done for physics: discover the fundamental laws governing human thought, emotion, and behavior.
But the treatise fell dead-born from the press, as Hume later lamented. It was largely ignored, poorly reviewed when noticed at all, and failed to establish his reputation. This devastated Hume, who had poured years of intense work into what he believed was groundbreaking philosophy. He later blamed the book's failure partly on its style and presentation rather than its content, and he spent the next decade rewriting and refining his ideas into more accessible forms. The result was 2 enquiries: an enquiry concerning human understanding in 1748 and an enquiry concerning the principles of morals in 1751. These shorter, clearer works presented Hume's core ideas with elegant prose and compelling examples, and they gradually earned him recognition as a major philosopher. But Hume's philosophical radicalism prevented him from obtaining university positions. He was twice rejected for professorships, first at Edinburgh in 1745, then at Glasgow in 1751, because religious authorities found his views heretical and atheistic. The Edinburgh rejection was particularly painful, as powerful clergy campaigned against him, calling his philosophy dangerous to religion and morality. So Hume earned his living through other means, as a tutor to the Marquess of Annandale in 1745 to 1746, as a secretary to General St. Clair on military expeditions in 1746, as a librarian to the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh in 1752, and eventually as a diplomat. He served as secretary to the British Embassy in Paris from 1763 to 1765, where he was lionized by French intellectuals. The Paris salons adored him. Philosophers like Diderot, d'Alembert, and Baron d'Albach treated him as a celebrity. Even Rousseau initially befriended him, though their relationship would end disastrously in 1766, when Rousseau's paranoia led him to believe Hume was conspiring against him, an accusation that hurt Hume deeply, since he had genuinely tried to help Rousseau when he was a refugee in England. Throughout his life, Hume remained remarkably even-tempered and sociable despite holding views that should have made him an outcast. He loved good food, good wine, good conversation. He played cards, attended parties, enjoyed company. He became quite corpulent in his later years, which his friends teased him about affectionately. When he was dying of cancer in 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he faced death with equanimity and even humor, joking with friends and showing no fear of annihilation. His peaceful death without any religious faith or hope of afterlife was controversial and challenged the assumption that religion was necessary for virtue or consolation. He died on August 25, 1776, at age 65, in Edinburgh. Hume's philosophical project was revolutionary in its ambition and method. He wanted to establish a science of human nature based entirely on experience and observation, rather than on metaphysical speculation or religious doctrine. Following John Locke and other British empiricists, Hume insisted that all knowledge begins with sensory experience. We have no innate ideas, no knowledge born within us. Everything we know comes from what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. But Hume pushed empiricism further than anyone before him, and in doing so he revealed devastating problems. If we rely entirely on experience, he showed, we can't prove the existence of causation, can't justify induction, can't establish the reality of the external world or the self, can't derive moral conclusions from factual premises. Empiricism, taken to its logical conclusion, leads to skepticism about nearly everything we think we know. This is what made Hume so dangerous and so important. He wasn't just offering an alternative philosophical system. He was exposing the limits of human reason itself, showing that many of our most basic beliefs we take completely for granted, rest on foundations that cannot be rationally justified. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow, but we can't prove it will. We believe that striking a match causes it to light, but we never observe causation itself, only the constant conjunction of events. We believe we have a continuous self that persists through time, but introspection reveals only a stream of perceptions, with no unified I observing them. Hume's genius was in making these problems unavoidable, in showing with devastating clarity that reason alone cannot answer the most fundamental questions about knowledge, reality, and morality. This is why Immanuel Kant, writing decades later, would say that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber, that reading Hume forced Kant to confront the inadequacy of rationalist philosophy and rebuild the entire foundation of metaphysics and ethics. Hume's challenges remain, in many ways, unanswered, and his influence continues to shape philosophy, science, and our understanding of the human mind.
Let's begin with what is perhaps Hume's most famous contribution to philosophy, the problem of induction. This problem is deceptively simple to state, but impossible to solve, and it undermines the rational basis of all empirical knowledge, including science. The problem is this: how do we know that the future will resemble the past? How do we justify our belief that patterns observed in the past will continue into the future? Consider the simplest example. The sun has risen every morning for as long as humans have existed. We've observed this pattern thousands, millions, billions of times. Based on this massive accumulation of experience, we confidently predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. This seems perfectly reasonable. In fact, it seems absurd to doubt it. But Hume asks, what is the rational justification for this inference? Why should the fact that the sun has always risen in the past give us any reason to think it will rise tomorrow?
You might respond, because natural laws are uniform. The same causes produce the same effects. The universe operates according to regular patterns. But Hume points out that this response merely restates the assumption we're trying to justify. The claim that nature is uniform, that the same causes always produce the same effects, is itself a generalization from past experience. We've observed uniformity in the past, and based on that, we conclude nature will continue to be uniform in the future. But this is circular reasoning. We're using past experience to justify our belief in the uniformity of nature, and then using the uniformity of nature to justify inferences from past experience to future events. We're assuming the very thing we need to prove. To understand why this matters, Hume distinguishes between two kinds of reasoning. First, there's demonstrative reasoning concerning relations of ideas like mathematics and logic. These yield certainty because their conclusions are contained in their premises. If you understand what a triangle is, you can deduce with certainty that its angles sum to 180 degrees. The denial of a mathematical truth is a contradiction. Try to imagine 2 plus 2 equaling 5. It's logically impossible. But Hume's second kind of reasoning, probable reasoning about matters of fact, is different. The opposite of any matter of fact is always conceivable without contradiction. I can imagine the sun not rising tomorrow. It may be wildly improbable, but it's not self-contradictory like denying a mathematical truth. There's no logical impossibility in the universe working differently tomorrow than it did today.
So we can't use demonstrative reasoning to prove the sun will rise tomorrow. Can we use probable reasoning based on experience? This brings us back to the problem. All probable reasoning about matters of fact is based on cause and effect, and our knowledge of cause and effect comes entirely from past experience. We've observed that one event, night, is constantly followed by another event, sunrise. From this constant conjunction, we infer a causal connection and predict that future nights will be followed by future sunrises. But what justifies this inference? Only the assumption that the future will resemble the past, which is precisely what we're trying to prove. We're trapped in a circle. Hume's conclusion is stark. We have no rational justification for induction. We cannot prove that the future will resemble the past. We cannot demonstrate that unobserved instances will conform to observed patterns. All of our beliefs about matters of fact beyond immediate perception, all of science, all of the common sense about the world, rest on an assumption that cannot be rationally justified. This doesn't mean our predictions are wrong. The sun will almost certainly rise tomorrow. Science works remarkably well. But Hume has shown that these successful predictions aren't based on rational proof. They're based on custom, habit, psychological expectation. We're psychologically constituted to form expectations based on past experience. But this psychological mechanism isn't rational justification. It's a fact about how human minds work, not a logical proof about how reality must be. This is devastating to the rationalist confidence of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment celebrated reason as the path to certain knowledge. Science was discovering the laws of nature through reason and observation. Progress seemed inevitable as reason replaced superstition. But Hume showed that even science rests on an unprovable assumption. The scientific method depends entirely on induction, observing patterns and inferring laws. But induction itself cannot be justified rationally. Every scientific prediction, every causal claim, every expectation about the future rests on faith in uniformity, not rational proof. Philosophers and scientists have struggled with Hume's problem of induction for nearly 3 centuries. No one has solved it. Some have tried to justify induction pragmatically. It worked, so we should use it. But Hume would respond that it has worked in the past doesn't prove it will work in the future unless we already assume uniformity. Others have tried probabilistic approaches, but probability judgments themselves depend on inductive reasoning. You can't escape the circle by using statistics, because statistics rely on the same assumption that past frequencies predict future probabilities. Karl Popper in the 20th century tried to sidestep the problem entirely by arguing that science doesn't prove theories true through induction, but only falsifies them through deduction. If a theory predicts X, and we observe not X, the theory is falsified. That's deductive logic, not induction. But even falsification requires assuming that a failed prediction tomorrow means the same thing as a failed prediction today, which presupposes uniformity. The problem persists. The problem of induction isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It has profound implications for how we understand knowledge and science. We tend to think of scientific knowledge as certain, proven, established. But Hume showed that empirical knowledge is always provisional, always dependent on assumptions we can't prove, always potentially falsifiable by future experience. This doesn't make science useless. Far from it. Science remains our best method for understanding the world. But it means we should hold scientific beliefs with epistemic humility, recognizing that even our most confident predictions rest on unprovable foundations. Modern artificial intelligence and machine learning face Hume's problem directly. These systems learn from past data and predict future outcomes based on observed patterns. They embody inductive reasoning computationally. A machine learning algorithm trained on millions of images learns to recognize cats by finding patterns in the training data. But it assumes those patterns will generalize to new images it hasn't seen. It assumes the future, new cat images, will resemble the past, the training images. This is pure Humean induction. When that assumption breaks down, when the distribution of data shifts, AI systems fail. They have no more rational justification for their predictions than we do. They assume that training data will generalize to new cases, that past patterns will continue, that the future will resemble the past. This assumption might be pragmatically justified, it often works, but it cannot be proven. Every AI prediction, like every human prediction, rests on unprovable faith in the uniformity of nature.
If the problem of induction wasn't devastating enough, Hume delivers two even more shocking blows. One to science, one to morality. First, he argues that causation itself is never observed. Second, he shows that you can never derive moral conclusions from factual premises. These two challenges undermine both our understanding of the natural world and our foundations for ethics. Let's examine each in turn. We believe we observe causes producing effects constantly. Striking a match causes fire. Dropping a glass causes it to shatter. Eating food causes nourishment. But Hume argues that we never actually perceive causation. We only perceive the constant conjunction of events. One thing happens, then another thing happens. We see the temporal sequence, the spatial contiguity, and if we see this pattern repeatedly, we form a psychological expectation that the second event will follow the first. But we never observe the causal power itself, the necessary connection that makes the first event produce the second.
Think carefully about what you actually observe when you see a billiard ball strike another and the second ball moves. This is Hume's own famous example. You see the first ball moving, you see it make contact with the second ball, you see the second ball begin to move. But do you see the causation? Do you observe the first ball's motion producing or necessitating or forcing the second ball's motion? Hume says no. You observe spatial contiguity, the balls are touching. You observe temporal succession, one event follows another. And if you've seen this pattern many times before, you observe constant conjunction. This sequence always happens. But the causal power itself, the necessary connection, the productivity that makes the first event compel the second, this is never observed. It's inferred, assumed, projected by the mind. This is extraordinary. Causation is fundamental to how we understand the world. Science is essentially the study of causal relationships. We want to know what causes disease, what causes economic growth, what causes climate change, what causes human behavior. The entire scientific enterprise assumes causation is real and discoverable.
But Hume argues that causation is a kind of illusion, a projection of the human mind rather than a feature of reality itself. When we say one event causes another, we're really just saying they're constantly conjoined in our experience, and our minds have formed a habit of expecting the second when we observe the first. Hume's analysis of causation involves distinguishing three components that we do observe from one component we don't. First, contiguity. The cause and effect are spatially close or connected. Second, temporal priority. The cause precedes the effect in time. Third, constant conjunction. Whenever we observe the cause, we observe the effect following. These three relationships are observable. But causation, we think, involves something more, necessary connection. The cause doesn't just happen to be followed by the effect. It must produce the effect. It necessitates the effect. It couldn't fail to produce the effect given the circumstances. And this necessity, Hume argues,
is never observed. We never perceive one event compelling another. We only observe regular succession. So where does our idea of necessity come from? Hume's answer is psychological rather than metaphysical. Through repeated observation of constant conjunction, our minds form a habit or custom. When we see one type of event, we automatically expect the other. This psychological expectation, this feeling of determination in our minds, gets projected onto the external world. We feel that the second event must follow, and we mistake the subjective feeling of expectation for an objective, necessary connection in nature. Causation, then, is really about psychological associations, not metaphysical necessities.
This might sound like philosophical wordplay, but the implications are revolutionary. If Hume is right, then the laws of nature aren't necessary truths about reality, but merely descriptions of observed regularities. There's no metaphysical necessity forcing water to boil at 100 degrees Celsius or objects to fall toward Earth. These are just patterns we've observed. They might continue, but there's no logical or metaphysical necessity ensuring they will. The universe could, without contradiction, behave differently tomorrow. Physics doesn't discover necessary laws, but describes contingent regularities. Science tells us what has happened, not what must happen. Moreover, if we never observe causation, how do we know causes even exist? Perhaps there are no causes, only correlations. Perhaps events just happen in sequence without any productive relationship between them. This seems absurd. Surely causes exist. Surely some events produce others. But Hume has shown we can't prove this from experience alone. All we observe are correlations, patterns, regularities. The causal connections we believe in are inferences, not observations. And these inferences can't be rationally justified without assuming what they're supposed to prove.
Modern philosophy of science grapples extensively with Hume's analysis. We've largely accepted that we don't observe causation directly, that causal claims are based on observed regularities. Statistical methods try to infer causation from correlation, but they're always probabilistic and depend on assumptions. Correlation doesn't imply causation has become a mantra in data science, reflecting Humean skepticism about inferring causal relationships from mere patterns. Randomized controlled trials try to establish causation by manipulating variables and observing effects. But even these presuppose that results observed in the trial will generalize to other contexts, which is an inductive inference subject to Hume's critique. Artificial intelligence and machine learning also embody Humean epistemology. Machine learning systems learn from data by detecting patterns and correlations. They don't understand causation, they identify regularities. When a neural network predicts outcomes, it's performing sophisticated pattern matching based on constant conjunctions observed in training data. This is pure Hume, no grasp of causal mechanisms, just associations between frequently conjoined variables. The systems work remarkably well for many purposes, but they lack causal understanding. They can't explain why patterns hold or predict when patterns will break down because they only encode statistical regularities, not causal structures. Modern work in AI, particularly by researchers like Judea Pearl, explicitly addresses this limitation by trying to build causal reasoning into machine learning systems. But doing so requires going beyond pure pattern recognition to incorporate causal models.
Neuroscience has also vindicated aspects of Hume's analysis. Studies show that our brains are prediction machines, constantly forming expectations based on past experience and using these expectations to anticipate future events.
When we perceive causation, we're often experiencing the brain's predictive processes. The feeling that one event must follow another is generated by neural networks that have learned temporal associations. In a sense, Hume was right. Our experience of causation is more about psychological expectation than observation of metaphysical necessity. The brain constructs the experience of causal connection from repeated temporal correlations, just as Hume suggested.
Now we turn to Hume's most important contribution to moral philosophy, the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine, because it severs the connection between factual statements and moral conclusions. This problem destroys natural law theories, challenges religious ethics, and fundamentally changes how we think about moral reasoning. The problem appears in a single paragraph in Hume's treatise, but it's one of the most influential passages in moral philosophy. Hume writes, "In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence." What Hume is pointing out is this: philosophers typically start with factual claims, descriptive statements about what is the case. God exists. Human beings are rational animals. People seek pleasure and avoid pain. These are factual claims that can, in principle, be verified or falsified. But then, without justification, these philosophers suddenly start making moral claims, prescriptive statements about what ought to be the case. We ought to obey God's commands. We ought to follow reason. We ought to maximize pleasure. The transition from is to ought happens imperceptibly, as if it required no justification, as if moral conclusions followed logically from factual premises.
But Hume insists this transition needs justification. How do you get from what is to what ought to be? How do you derive prescriptive conclusions from descriptive premises? This is the is-ought problem, and it's devastating to traditional moral philosophy. Natural law theory, dominant for centuries, held that morality could be derived from facts about human nature and the natural order. Thomas Aquinas argued that by examining human nature, our natural inclinations, purposes, and flourishing, we can discover moral laws. Humans naturally seek knowledge, so we ought to pursue truth. Humans naturally form societies, so we ought to respect social bonds. The ought was thought to follow from the is of human nature. But Hume's challenge is, why? Why does the fact that humans naturally do something mean they ought to do it? Many natural human inclinations are morally problematic. Humans naturally compete for resources, but that doesn't make greed virtuous. Humans naturally form in-groups and distrust out-groups, but that doesn't make xenophobia right. The move from factual observation about human nature to moral conclusion requires an additional premise. A premise stating that what is natural is good. But this premise is itself a moral claim, not a factual one, so it can't be derived from natural facts alone.
Religious ethics faces the same problem. Many religious traditions argue that God's nature, or God's commands, provide the foundation for morality. God is good, God commands certain actions, therefore those actions are morally right. But again, why does God's nature or God's commands create moral obligations? Saying God commands X is a factual claim about what God does. Saying we ought to obey God's commands is a moral claim about what we should do. The latter doesn't logically follow from the former unless we add a moral premise.
we ought to obey God. But this premise is precisely what needs justification. Why ought we obey God? Because God created us. That's a factual claim about causation. Because God is all-powerful, that's a factual claim about capacity. Neither fact, by itself, creates a moral obligation. The is-ought gap remains. Hume's point isn't that we can never reason from facts to moral conclusions. It's that we can't do so without importing moral premises. If you want to derive an ought conclusion, you need at least one ought premise. Factual premises alone can never generate moral conclusions. This means that morality can't be purely descriptive or naturalistic. It can't be reduced to facts about biology, psychology, social organization, divine commands, or natural purposes. Moral reasoning requires normative premises, claims about what matters, what has value, what we ought to care about. And these normative premises can't themselves be derived from pure fact.
This has profound implications. It means that empirical science alone can't tell us what to do. Science can tell us what is, how the world works, what consequences follow from actions, what people value. But it can't tell us what ought to be, what we should value, which consequences matter morally, what actions are right or wrong. This doesn't make science irrelevant to ethics. Of course, we need factual knowledge to make good moral decisions. But factual knowledge must be combined with moral values to generate prescriptive conclusions. It also means that moral disagreements can't always be resolved by appeal to facts. If two people share moral premises but disagree about facts, then factual investigation can resolve their disagreement. But if they have different foundational moral premises, no amount of factual inquiry will reconcile them. If one person values individual liberty above all, and another values collective welfare above all, they might reach different moral conclusions, even given identical factual information. Their disagreement is normative, not empirical. The is-ought problem challenges moral realism, the view that moral facts exist independently of human attitudes and can be discovered through reason or observation. If you can't derive ought from is, and if all observations yield only is statements, then how do we discover moral truths? We can't observe them like we observe physical objects. We can't deduce them from pure reason like we deduce mathematical truths. So where do moral claims come from? Hume's answer, which connects to his analysis of causation, is that they come from sentiment, from feelings of approval and disapproval that arise in response to observed facts. But this makes morality subjective, based on human psychology rather than objective reality. Modern metaethics, the study of the nature and status of moral claims, is largely defined by responses to Hume's is-ought problem. Some philosophers accept the gap and argue for non-naturalism. Moral facts exist, but can't be reduced to natural facts. Others embrace the gap and defend moral non-cognitivism or emotivism. Moral statements don't make factual claims at all, but express attitudes or prescribe actions. Still others try to bridge the gap through various strategies, arguing that certain facts necessarily entail values, or that normative properties supervene on natural properties, or that moral language has both descriptive and prescriptive dimensions. But no one denies that Hume identified a genuine problem, one that any adequate moral theory must address. Notice the parallel between these two problems. With causation, we observe patterns, constant conjunction, and project necessity onto them. We can't derive the necessity from the observations alone. With morality, we observe facts about the world
and project obligation onto them. We can't derive the obligation from the facts alone. In both cases, Hume shows that something crucial, necessity in causation, obligation in morality, isn't contained in what we observe. It's added by the mind. Both are psychological projections rather than features of objective reality.
This is why Hume's philosophy is so unsettling. It suggests that two things we take to be fundamental features of reality, causal connections and moral truths, might be constructions of the human mind rather than discoveries about the world. The universe doesn't contain causation as we conceive it, only regular patterns. Reality doesn't contain moral facts, only natural facts about which we have feelings. If Hume is right, both science and ethics rest on foundations that aren't as solid as we thought they were. Yet Hume himself wasn't a nihilist. He didn't conclude that science is useless or that morality is arbitrary. Instead, he argued that we should understand these domains differently. Science works through identifying regularities and making predictions, even if we can't prove causation or justify induction philosophically. Morality works through shared human sentiments, particularly sympathy, our capacity to feel concern for others, even if moral claims aren't factual truths. Both domains can be valuable and functional without the metaphysical foundations we once thought they required. The questions Hume raised remain with us. In an age of big data and AI, we still struggle to distinguish correlation from causation. In debates about moral foundations, we still grapple with the is-ought gap. Can science tell us how to live? Can we ground ethics in human nature or divine commands? Can machines understand causation or make moral judgments? These are Hume's questions, and we're still trying to answer them more than 2.5 centuries later.
Now we reach perhaps Hume's most provocative claim, the one that directly challenges the entire rationalist tradition in ethics. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This shocking statement appears in the treatise, and it overturns centuries of moral philosophy. From Plato through the Stoics to Descartes and Kant, the dominant view held that reason should govern the passions, that rationality should master emotion, that morality consists in following reason against inclination. Hume reverses this completely. Reason, he argues, cannot motivate action. Only passions, desires, emotions, sentiments can motivate. Reason merely calculates means to ends that passion sets.
Let's unpack this carefully because it's easy to misunderstand. Hume isn't saying we should be irrational or that we should let emotions run wild without any self-control. He's making a philosophical claim about the nature of motivation. Consider what happens when you act. You decide to get coffee. Why? Because you desire coffee. You decide to help a friend. Why? Because you care about your friend's welfare. You decide to avoid danger. Why? Because you fear harm. In every case, there's a desire, emotion, or sentiment driving the action. The passion provides the goal, the end, the purpose. Reason can tell you how to achieve that goal, where to find coffee, how to help effectively, which dangers to avoid. But reason can't create the goal itself. It can't make you want coffee if you have no desire for it. It can't make you care about your friend's welfare if you're completely indifferent to it.
This is what Hume means by reason being the slave of the passions. Reason serves passion by figuring out how to satisfy desires, but it can't generate desires itself. It's an instrument, a tool for achieving ends set by our passions. Hume goes further with a deliberately provocative example. "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. This sounds absurd, even monstrous. But Hume's point is that reason alone can't tell you what to value. If someone genuinely cared more about their finger's comfort than about the entire world's existence, reason couldn't prove them wrong. Reason can point out contradictions in belief, calculate consequences, identify means to ends, but it can't create values from nothing. This challenges the entire rationalist approach to ethics. Kant would later argue that pure practical reason can determine what we ought to do, independent of any desires or inclinations. The categorical imperative, Kant claims, binds us through reason alone. We recognize our duty through rational reflection, and this recognition motivates us to act regardless of what we want or feel. Hume says this is impossible. Reason alone, without any passion or sentiment, is perfectly inert. It can discover truth and falsehood, but it can't motivate action. You might rationally recognize that stealing is wrong, but this recognition alone won't prevent you from stealing unless you have some sentiment, concern for others, fear of punishment, desire for self-respect, commitment to integrity that makes you care about not doing wrong.
Hume distinguishes between two ways reason operates in relation to action. First, reason can inform us about matters of fact relevant to our goals. If you want to be healthy, and you believe that smoking is unhealthy, reason tells you not to smoke. Second, reason can trace causal relations between means and ends. If you want to get to the airport, and you know the route, reason tells you which turns to take. But in both cases, reason is operating in service of pre-existing desires. The desire for health makes the fact about smoking's harm relevant. The desire to reach the airport makes the route information useful. Without desire, factual knowledge and causal reasoning have no motivational force.
This has radical implications for moral philosophy. If reason can't motivate, then moral requirements can't be purely rational. They must engage our sentiments somehow. This leads Hume to his positive account of morality, which we'll examine in the next section. Morality is based on sentiments of approval and disapproval that arise naturally in response to actions and characters. We feel approval when we observe actions that promote human well-being, and we feel disapproval when we observe actions that cause harm. These sentiments, not rational principles, are the foundation of moral judgment. Modern psychology and neuroscience have largely vindicated Hume's position. Research on moral psychology shows that moral judgments are typically driven by quick, automatic emotional responses rather than careful, rational deliberation. When people are presented with moral scenarios, their emotional reactions occur within milliseconds, before conscious reasoning can take place. The rational arguments people offer for their moral views often come after the emotional judgment, serving to justify rather than generate the judgment. This is exactly what Hume predicted. Passion leads, reason follows, and rationalizes.
Neuroscience has identified distinct brain systems for emotional processing and rational deliberation. Emotional systems, particularly involving the amygdala, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and related structures, respond rapidly to moral stimuli and generate feelings of approval, disapproval, empathy, disgust. These emotional responses strongly influence moral judgment. Damage to emotional processing areas impairs moral judgment, even when rational capacities remain intact. People with such damage often show reduced concern for others' welfare, suggesting that emotional engagement is necessary for normal moral motivation. Moreover, research on motivation confirms that desires drive action. The dopamine system, crucial for motivation, responds to anticipated rewards and desired outcomes. We're motivated to pursue what we desire and avoid what we fear or dislike. purely abstract, rational considerations disconnected from any emotional valence or desire-based relevance don't engage motivational systems.
This doesn't mean reason is unimportant. Rational deliberation can refine our goals, identify better means, resolve conflicts between desires, and help us recognize when emotional responses might mislead us. But reason operates in service of goals ultimately set by our wants, cares, and concerns, by passion, in Hume's terms. This creates a challenge for moral philosophy. If reason alone can't motivate, and if morality requires motivation, then morality must somehow engage our passions. But different people have different passions, different desires, different emotional sensibilities. Does this make morality relative? Hume tries to avoid this conclusion by arguing that human nature is sufficiently uniform that we share certain sentiments, particularly sympathy, the capacity to feel concerned for others' well-being. This shared emotional foundation provides enough commonality for moral agreement, at least within broad limits. But Hume's account raises questions about moral objectivity that continue to challenge philosophers today.
Having demolished rationalist foundations of ethics, Hume needs an alternative account of morality. If morality doesn't come from reason, and you can't derive ought from is, where do moral judgments come from? His answer: sentiment. Specifically, sentiments of approval and disapproval that naturally arise when we observe actions and character traits. Morality is fundamentally about feelings, not facts or rational principles. When we call an action virtuous or vicious, we're expressing a sentiment of approval or disapproval, not discovering an objective moral fact. Hume begins his analysis by noting that we make moral judgments. We are responding to something real. We observe actions and their consequences. We perceive character traits and their effects. We witness behavior and its impact on human welfare. But the moral quality itself, the virtue or vice, the rightness or wrongness, isn't observed like physical properties. When you see someone helping an elderly person cross the street, you observe the physical movements, the elderly person's need, the helpful action, the successful crossing. But the goodness of the action isn't an additional observable property. You don't see goodness the way you see movement. Rather, you feel approval. The moral quality is your response to what you observe, not a feature of what you observe. This makes Hume's ethics what modern philosophers call non-cognitive or expressivist, though these terms came later. Moral judgments don't report facts, but express sentiments. When you say helping others is virtuous, you're outstating a fact like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. You're expressing approval of helping behavior, perhaps recommending that others approve of it too. This doesn't make moral judgments meaningless or arbitrary, but it does make them subjective in an important sense. They're grounded in human emotional responses rather than independent moral facts.
But Hume doesn't think this leads to extreme relativism or nihilism. While moral sentiments are subjective responses rather than objective facts, they're not arbitrary or completely variable. Human nature is sufficiently uniform that we share certain moral sentiments. The most important is sympathy, the capacity to feel concern for others' welfare, to be pleased by their pleasure and pained by their suffering. Sympathy isn't pure altruism or selflessness, but it's a natural emotional mechanism that allows us to resonate with others' experiences. When we see someone in pain, we feel discomfort. When we see someone happy, we feel pleasure. This sympathetic resonance creates shared moral responses. Because humans are similar in their natures and needs, and because sympathy allows us to feel concern for others, we tend to approve of actions that promote human welfare and disapprove of actions that cause harm. We admire courage because it enables people to overcome fear and act beneficially. We despise cruelty because it causes unnecessary suffering. We value honesty because it facilitates cooperation and trust. We condemn betrayal because it destroys relationships and harms those who trusted. These moral sentiments aren't arbitrary preferences like taste in food. They're stable human responses to features of actions and characters that consistently affect human well-being. Hume places particular emphasis on utility, usefulness in promoting human welfare. We approve of qualities that are useful or agreeable, either to the person possessing them or to others. Honesty is useful because it facilitates cooperation. Generosity is agreeable to those who receive it. Intelligence is useful to the person who possesses it. Wit is agreeable to others. Because of this utility emphasis, Hume is sometimes called a proto-utilitarian. But Hume's position is more complex than simple utilitarianism. He recognizes that we approve of some qualities for their immediate agreeableness rather than for their consequences. And he allows that moral sentiments can be shaped by social conventions and cultural practices.
This leads to Hume's account of justice as an artificial virtue, one of his most important but potentially confusing ideas. Natural virtues like benevolence and compassion arise directly from human nature and sympathy. We naturally feel concern for those close to us, and we naturally approve of kindness. But justice, respect for property rights, keeping promises, following laws, doesn't arise as naturally. In small groups with plentiful resources, justice is unnecessary. People just share freely and trust others to be generous. But in larger societies with scarce resources, conflicts arise. Whose property is this? Who gets what? How do we ensure people keep their agreements? Justice is the solution to these coordination problems. We establish conventions about property and contracts, and we approve of following these conventions because we recognize they're necessary for social cooperation. Justice is artificial, not because it's fake or arbitrary, but because it depends on human conventions rather than arising directly from natural sentiment. The specific rules of justice vary across societies: what counts as legitimate property, how contracts work, which promises are binding. But the general principle that we need agreed-upon rules for social cooperation is universal. Once the rules are established, we approve of following them and disapprove of violating them because we recognize their utility for social order. Hume's sentiment-based ethics faces several challenges. First, if morality is based on feelings, what about people whose feelings are different? Psychopaths lack normal moral sentiments. They don't feel empathy or guilt. Does morality not apply to them? Humes might respond that psychopaths are moral defectives, like people born without sight are visual defectives. Just as we don't conclude that colors aren't real because some people are colorblind, we shouldn't conclude morality isn't real because some people lack moral sentiments. But this response seems to assume that certain moral sentiments are the correct ones, which seems to reintroduce a kind of objectivity. Second, if moral judgments express sentiments rather than stating facts, can they be true or false? This leads to complex metaethics debates about moral cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. If moral claims aren't fact-stating, they can't be literally true or false. Yet we certainly argue about moral questions as if we're debating truths. Hume's position requires explaining what moral disagreement consists in if it's not disagreement about facts. Third, sentiment-based ethics struggles to explain moral obligation. We don't just approve of virtuous actions, we feel they're required, obligatory, binding. Where does this normative force come from if morality is just a sentiment? Hume can say that we have strong feelings about certain actions, that we desire others to act in certain ways, but the feeling of obligation, the sense that one must do something regardless of what one wants, seems to go beyond mere sentiment.
Despite these challenges, Hume's sentiment-based approach has been enormously influential. Emotivism in the 20th century developed his expressivist insights. Moral psychology has confirmed that moral judgment centrally involves emotional processing. Evolutionary accounts trace moral sentiments to adaptations promoting cooperation. Neuroscience has identified the emotional systems underlying moral judgment. Contemporary moral philosophers increasingly recognize that purely rationalist accounts of ethics face serious problems that Hume identified centuries ago.
Now we reach Hume's most radical claim, one that challenges our most fundamental assumption about ourselves. There is no self. Or, more precisely, there is no unified, continuing self that persists through time as the subject of our experiences. What we call the self is really just a bundle of perceptions, a stream of thoughts, sensations, emotions, and memories with no underlying unity. The bundle theory of the self undermines our most basic conviction that there is an I experiencing our experiences, thinking our thoughts, performing our actions. Hume arrives at this shocking conclusion through his characteristic empiricist method. Look at your experience and see what's actually there. When Descartes sought absolute certainty, he concluded, "I think, therefore I am." The existence of the thinking self was the one indubitable truth. But Hume examines his own experience and finds no such self. He writes, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." What does Hume mean? When you introspect, when you look inward at your own consciousness, what do you actually observe? You observe thoughts, sensations, feelings, memories. You're thinking about something, feeling an emotion, sensing your surroundings, remembering the past. But do you observe the I that's supposedly having these thoughts and feelings? Hume says no. You observe the thoughts, but not a thinker distinct from the thoughts. You observe the feelings, but not a feeler separate from the feelings. The self that's supposed to be having the experiences never appears in experience itself.
The self, Hume concludes, is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. There's no continuous, unchanging self underlying these perceptions. There are only the perceptions themselves, connected by relations of similarity, causation, and contiguity in memory. When you remember yesterday's experiences, there's a causal connection between those past perceptions and your current memory. When you anticipate tomorrow's experiences, your expectation is based on past patterns. These connections create a sense of unity, a feeling that there's a continuous me persisting through time. But this unity is constructed, not discovered. It's a pattern we project onto the stream of experiences, not an independently existing entity. This is deeply counterintuitive. We're so convinced that we exist as continuing selves that Hume's denial seems absurd. Of course I'm the same person today as yesterday, as 10 years ago, as when I was born. But Hume asks, what makes you the same person? Not your body. Your physical substance changes constantly. Cells die and are replaced. Your body at 50 shares almost no physical matter with your body at birth. Not your memories. You can't remember most of your life, and memories are often inaccurate or constructed. Not your psychological traits. Personality, beliefs, desires, and values change dramatically over a lifetime. So what exactly persists? What is the you that remains identical through all these changes? Hume's answer, nothing persists. There is no identical self.
There's only a sequence of causally connected mental states. We retrospectively construct a narrative of personal identity. We tell ourselves a story about my life, my experiences, my character, and we reify this narrative construction into an entity called the self. But the self is the story, not the author of the story. It's a useful fiction, psychologically and socially necessary, but not a metaphysical reality.
This has profound implications. If there's no continuing self, personal identity through time is, at best, conventional, at worst, illusory. The person who committed a crime 10 years ago isn't, in a metaphysically strict sense, the same person being punished today. They share causal connections and memory links, but they're not numerically identical. This doesn't mean we shouldn't hold people responsible. Social stability requires treating people as continuing selves, but it undermines the metaphysical justification for punishment and desert. Similarly, if there's no self, prudential concern for your future self becomes puzzling. Why should you sacrifice now for future benefit? The future person you'll become isn't, strictly speaking, you. They're causally connected to you, but they're a distinct bundle of perceptions. You might care about them through psychological connections and projected empathy, just as you might care about other people. But there's no metaphysical unity requiring self-concern. Modern neuroscience has largely vindicated Hume's skepticism about the self. Neuroscientists find no unified self region in the brain. Instead, they find distributed processes, memory systems, sensory processing, emotional responses, executive functions, operating in parallel and interacting in complex ways. The feeling of a unified self is generated by these processes, but there's no central controller, no homunculus inside observing and directing everything. Consciousness appears to be more like what philosopher Daniel Dennett calls multiple drafts, parallel processing streams that create a retrospective sense of unity without any actual unified self.
Split brain patients provide dramatic evidence for this. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's two hemispheres is severed to treat severe epilepsy, the two hemispheres can process information independently and even display different preferences and responses. Where is the unified self in a split brain patient? Each hemisphere seems to have its own stream of consciousness, its own perceptions and responses. This suggests that the unified self we normally experience is a construct made possible by neural integration, not a fundamental fact about consciousness. Buddhist philosophy, particularly the doctrine of anatta, or no self, parallels Hume's conclusions remarkably. Buddhist meditation practices aim to reveal through direct observation what Hume argued philosophically, that careful introspective examination finds no permanent self, only a stream of momentary mental states. Some scholars have explored connections between Hume and Buddhism, though there's no evidence Hume knew Buddhist thought. The convergence suggests that careful introspective analysis, whether philosophical or meditative, tends toward skepticism about the self. Hume himself was somewhat troubled by these conclusions. Near the end of the treatise, in the appendix, he admits that his account of personal identity is unsatisfactory and that he lacks a solution to the problems he's raised. This intellectual honesty is characteristic of Hume. He won't pretend to solve problems he finds genuinely difficult. The self remains mysterious. We feel like unified, continuing beings, but careful examination reveals only bundles of perceptions. The tension remains unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. We can't help experiencing ourselves as selves, even if philosophically and scientifically we have reasons to doubt that the self exists in the way we experience it.
Notice the deep connection between these two claims.
Morality, Hume argues, isn't discovered in the world but projected onto it by our sentiments. The self, he argues, isn't discovered in experience but constructed from streams of perceptions. Both are cases where something we take to be fundamental, moral facts, the continuing self, turns out to be a construction of the human mind rather than a feature of objective reality. This connects to Hume's broader philosophical project. Again and again, he shows that what we take to be objective features of reality, causation, necessary connection, moral truths, the unified self, are actually contributions of the mind. We're not passive observers discovering a ready-made world. We're active constructors, imposing patterns, projecting necessities, creating unities. This doesn't mean the world is whatever we want it to be. Our constructions are constrained by experience, shaped by human nature, refined by reason. But it means that the boundary between mind and world is more blurred than we thought.
For morality, this is both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because we can't appeal to objective moral facts written into the universe. There's no cosmic authority validating our values. But liberating because morality becomes a human project, grounded in shared sentiments and pursued through sympathetic engagement with others' well-being. We don't need metaphysical foundations to care about suffering, to value justice, to build cooperative societies. For the self, Hume's conclusion is similarly double-edged. It's unsettling to think we might not exist as we believe we do, that personal identity is constructed rather than discovered. But it's also liberating to recognize that the self is fluid, changeable, open to reconstruction. We're not stuck with fixed essences. We're dynamic processes, constantly becoming rather than permanently being. These insights remain relevant today. In debates about moral foundations, we still grapple with whether values are discovered or constructed, whether ethics needs objective grounding or can rest on shared human sentiments. In consciousness studies, we still struggle with whether the self is a real entity or a useful fiction, whether personal identity has metaphysical substance or is merely narrative coherence.
Hume doesn't resolve these questions definitively, but he shows us that our most basic assumptions about causation, morality, and the self deserve scrutiny. What seems obvious may be projection. What seems discovered may be constructed. What seems unified may be bundled. This skeptical stance isn't meant to paralyze us, but to make us thoughtful, humble, and aware of the gap between how things appear and how they are. We've traced Hume's revolutionary skepticism through his major challenges: the problem of induction, showing we can't rationally justify predictions about the future; the analysis of causation, revealing we never observe causal power itself; the is-ought problem, demonstrating you can't derive moral conclusions from factual premises; the claim that reason is the slave of the passions, showing that motivation comes from emotion, not rationality; the sentiment-based account of morality, grounding ethics in feeling rather than reason; and the bundle theory of self, arguing there's no unified, continuing subject of experience. Each of these challenges remains unanswered and continues shaping philosophy, science, and our understanding of human nature. Hume's greatest achievement was exposing the limits of human reason. The Enlightenment celebrated reason as the path to certain knowledge, moral truth, and human progress. But Hume showed that reason alone cannot justify our most basic beliefs about the world, cannot motivate moral action,
cannot even establish its own reliability. This isn't nihilism or irrationalism. Hume didn't conclude we should abandon reason or science. He concluded we should recognize that reason operates within limits, that human knowledge rests on foundations reason cannot prove, and that a skepticism about metaphysical certainty is appropriate while we continue making practical judgments. This moderate skepticism has been remarkably fruitful. In science, it led to fallibilism, the recognition that scientific theories are always provisional, subject to revision by new evidence.
Karl Popper built his philosophy of science on Humean foundations, arguing that science proceeds not by proving theories true, but by attempting to falsify them. In epistemology, it led to naturalized approaches that study how humans actually form beliefs rather than how idealized reasoners should. In ethics, it led to recognition that moral philosophy must engage with human psychology and emotion, not just abstract principles. Hume's influence on subsequent philosophy is immense. Immanuel Kant explicitly said that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. Kant's entire critical philosophy, the three critiques that rebuilt epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics, was largely motivated by trying to answer Hume's challenges. Could Kant rescue causation, induction, moral rationalism, and the self from Humean skepticism? Kant thought so, but whether he succeeded remains hotly debated. Many philosophers think Hume's challenges remain unanswered, that Kant's solutions ultimately fail. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill built utilitarianism on Humean foundations. Hume's emphasis on utility, his grounding of morality in sentiments rather than reason, his recognition that pleasure and pain drive human behavior, all of these influenced utilitarian ethics. Mill explicitly acknowledged his debt to Hume. The logical positivists in the 20th century revived Humean empiricism, arguing that meaningful statements must be either empirically verifiable or logically analytic. Though logical positivism eventually collapsed, its Humean roots remain influential in analytic philosophy's emphasis on clarity, empirical grounding, and skepticism about metaphysics. Modern cognitive science is thoroughly Humean. Studies of how humans actually reason reveal we rely heavily on heuristics, habits, and associations rather than logical deduction. We form expectations based on observed patterns, pure Humean induction. We perceive causation through temporal and spatial associations, Hume's constant conjunction. Moral judgments arise from rapid emotional responses, Humean sentiment. Artificial intelligence and machine learning embody Humean epistemology computationally. They learn from data through pattern recognition, forming associations between frequently conjoined variables without grasping causal mechanisms. They're Humean reasoners, sophisticated but limited, effective but without understanding. Neuroscience continues vindicating Hume's insights about self, emotion, and motivation. Brain imaging shows moral judgment engages emotional systems before rational deliberation. Damage to emotional processing impairs moral judgment even when reasoning remains intact, confirming that sentiment is fundamental to morality. Studies of consciousness reveal no unified self, but distributed processes creating a retrospective sense of unity, Hume's bundle theory. Research on motivation shows desires drive goal-directed behavior, while reason calculates means, reason as slave of passions. Yet Hume's conclusions remain troubling. If induction can't be justified, how is science possible? If causation isn't real, how do we understand the world? If you can't derive ought from is, how do we ground morality? If reason can't motivate, how can we be rational moral agents? If there's no self, who's responsible for actions? These questions don't have satisfying answers. Hume identified genuine puzzles that can't be dissolved by clever arguments. We must live with uncertainty, with beliefs we can't fully justify, with foundations we can't prove. But Hume thought this was fine. We're built to form beliefs through custom and habit rather than proof. We naturally believe in causation, induction, external objects, and continuing selves. These beliefs are products of human nature, and they work well enough for practical purposes. Skeptical philosophy can reveal that beliefs lack rational justification, but it can't and shouldn't eliminate them. We should be epistemically humble, recognizing the limits of human knowledge, while still engaging practically with the world. This measured skepticism, neither dogmatic rationalism nor paralyzing doubt, is Hume's legacy. He taught philosophy to be less confident in reason's powers, more attentive to human psychology, more aware that many questions have no certain answers. He showed that empiricism, taken seriously, leads to surprising places. He demonstrated that morality doesn't require metaphysical foundations or religious authority. He did all this with remarkable clarity, wit, and humanity. Unlike many philosophers, Hume wasn't trying to build grand systems or establish ultimate truths. He was exploring human nature, examining our limitations, and accepting that some mysteries remain beyond reason's reach. The questions Hume raised remain our questions. In an age of big data and artificial intelligence, we still grapple with distinguishing correlation from causation, pure Hume. In debates about moral foundations, we still struggle with the is-ought gap. In discussions of consciousness and artificial intelligence, we still wonder about the nature of self. In epistemology and philosophy of science, we still face the problem of induction. Hume didn't solve these problems. He showed they're insoluble, at least by pure reason. But he also showed we can live with uncertainty, form useful beliefs without certain foundations, and be moral without metaphysical guarantees. This is perhaps his most important lesson. We can be thoughtful, ethical, and effective even while recognizing the limits of what we can know and prove. We can embrace skepticism without succumbing to despair. We can acknowledge that much of what we believe rests on habit and sentiment rather than rational proof, while still taking our beliefs seriously and living well. David Hume remains one of philosophy's most important and challenging thinkers precisely because he forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of human reason and the foundations of our beliefs. His legacy is not a system of answers, but a set of questions that continue to shape how we think about knowledge, morality, and ourselves. Thank you for joining me on Timeless Thinkers. We've met the great skeptic who challenged everything. And remember Hume's lesson: be humble about what you can know for certain, but live boldly with the beliefs you have. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep learning. Subscribe for more.